Okay, thank you, Agneta. So it's a pleasure and honor for me to speak to you today, and I especially want to thank my dear friend and colleague Agneta for inviting me. As she mentioned, this is, I think, the 6th time I've had the opportunity to speak in Sweden, and I'm very happy to meet old friends again and to meet new ones. Now, as Agneta said, she translated most of this paper. It's a very long paper, so some of it is left out. I don't know if she will be translating it eventually, but I'm going to add some additional citations and provide it to Agneta in its final form so she can use it as she wishes. I also want to mention that Agneta asked, where does this information come from? And it's very important for you to know that all of the things that I'm going to say are substantiated with government documents from the United States, budget documents, Air Force reports, and so on. And in the English version, I have 68 endnotes, references. So those are available to you. If I say something that you find just impossible to believe, I can give you a link on the internet where you can look up the source document. So let me begin. And you do have the text in Swedish if you want to follow along. I will stay pretty close to that text. So President Obama's April 5th, 2009 speech in Prague launched a tidal wave of expectations around the world that the abolition of nuclear weapons was finally on the horizon. But Obama made conflicting statements in Prague, which have created confusion and misunderstandings about the current state of U.S. nuclearism and prospects for disarmament. His administration's foreign policy has similarly been characterized by contradictory positions, rhetorically emphasizing the importance of diplomacy, while in reality relying heavily on the use of force. Some believe that Obama's pledge to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons is unprecedented. Yet in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty itself, the U.S. and the other original nuclear weapon states pledged to end the arms race at an early date and to negotiate in good faith the elimination of their nuclear arsenals. 42 years later, and more than 2 decades after the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, some 20,000 nuclear weapons remain in the global arsenal, 95% of them possessed by the United States and Russia. And there are disturbing signs that a new Cold War-type nuclear arms race is emerging. This time it will be qualitative rather than quantitative, involving fewer but newer nuclear weapons, still in quantities sufficient to end civilization in short order. At its peak in 1966, it's estimated that the U.S. nuclear arsenal numbered over 32,000 warheads and bombs. In 2010, the U.S. released information about the size of its nuclear arsenal, stating that as of the end of 2009, it had an active stockpile of 5,113 nuclear weapons. This number includes both active and inactive warheads, with the active category including strategic and non-strategic weapons maintained in operational, ready-for-use configuration, warheads that must be ready for possible deployment within a short time frame, and logistic spares. In addition, the U.S. has several thousand nuclear weapons listed as retired. Independent experts estimate that there are approximately 3,500 such retired warheads, and an unknown percentage of these supposedly retired warheads are being held in a managed retirement status, which requires that they be maintained in such a way that they could be reactivated should a catastrophic failure in the stockpile necessitate such action. And those descriptive terms I'm using are the actual quotes from the U.S. government document. Despite the dramatic reductions in numbers from the height of the Cold War, nuclear weapons continue to pose an existential threat to humanity and to life on this planet. As recent studies by climate scientists have shown, a nuclear war involving no more than 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons. That's only 0.3% of the global nuclear arsenal. 0.3% of the global nuclear arsenal could have terrifying, long-lasting effects on the global climate, leading to a drop in average surface temperatures, reduction of the ozone layer, and shortened agricultural growing seasons, leading to massive famine and starvation. And as the terrible earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disaster in Japan have shown us once again, there could be no adequate response to the far larger catastrophe of a nuclear explosion in a city anywhere today. While earthquakes and tsunamis are acts of nature, a nuclear weapon's use is a 100% preventable, man-made act of hubris. And I would add, so is building nuclear reactors in active earthquake and tsunami zones. The U.S. government today is officially committed to modernizing its nuclear bombs and warheads, the submarines, missiles, and aircraft that carry them, and the laboratories and plants that design, maintain, and manufacture nuclear weapons. U.S. policy and budget documents all manifest an intent to keep thousands of nuclear weapons in active service for the foreseeable future, together with the capacity to bring stored weapons into service and to design and manufacture new weapons should they be desired. Russia's nuclear weapons programs and policies closely mirror those of the U.S., and are also reflected in the other nuclear weapon-possessing states. Paradoxically, cynically, or perversely, however you choose to define it, these programs are being driven by treaty negotiations understood by most of the world to be intended as disarmament measures. The Cold War and post-Cold War approach to disarmament was quantitative, based mainly on bringing down the insanely huge Cold War stockpile numbers, presumably en route to zero. But now disarmament has been turned on its head. By pruning away the grotesque Cold War excesses, nuclear disarmament for all practical purposes has come to mean fewer but newer nuclear weapons systems, with an emphasis on huge long-term investments in nuclear weapons infrastructures and qualitative improvements in the weapons themselves, projected for decades to come. And keep in mind that these nuclear weapons do not exist in isolation. While the personality at the top of the U.S. government changes from time to time, the architecture and special interests that underpin it have not. The U.S. spends nearly as much as the rest of the world's countries combined on its military. In 2010, the U.S. spent $698 billion on its military, more than the next 17 countries combined. U.S. military spending in 2010 was almost 6 times larger than the next biggest spender, China, and more than 11 times that of Russia. And in 2008, the United States spent an estimated $52.4 billion on nuclear weapons and associated costs alone. Obama's remarks in Prague notwithstanding, this is what he said when he presented his military budget request for 2010, quote, "Going forward, we will continue to make the investments necessary to strengthen our military and increase our ground forces to defeat the threats of the 21st century." More than 2.5 million U.S. personnel are already deployed around the world. The U.S. military dominates the globe through its operation of 10 unified combatant commands, overseeing a network of more than 1,000 foreign bases in about 130 countries.
Wait a minute, I just want, how can I pick up, just because when you talk about this, it's so important to see the map here. No, it is impossible. Well, the map here shows all the bases that she's talking about. I pointed them out on this map. It should be, but I don't know how to open this.
Okay.
You can scrutinize this map later on, because there you see where they are deployed.
Right, and these unified combatant commands that I mentioned, that basically those are divisions that have, where the U.S. military has divided up the world into 10 zones. And which contain these 1,000 bases. And the global operations are coordinated by United States Strategic Command, which is headquartered in Omaha, Nebraska, which is in charge of U.S. nuclear war planning. So in other words, the same Strategic Command that oversees the operation of the Unified Combatant Commands and the military bases is also in charge of U.S. nuclear war planning. It's all integrated. A November 2010 White House fact sheet entitled, quote, "An Enduring Commitment to the U.S. Nuclear Deterrent," announced the Obama administration's plans, quote, "to invest more than $85 billion over the next decade to modernize the U.S. nuclear weapons complex that supports our deterrent." Still quoting, "This level of funding is unprecedented since the end of the Cold War," end quote. This didn't include an additional $100 billion by 2020 to modernize the missiles and delivery systems that carry U.S. nuclear warheads. In testimony before a congressional committee on March 2nd, 2011, Dr. James Miller, a Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, increased the numbers again, stating, quote, "The administration's fiscal year 2012 budget reflects our commitment to the modernization of our nuclear arsenal for the long term, including some $125 billion over the next 10 years to sustain our strategic delivery systems, and about $88 billion over the same period to sustain our nuclear arsenal and modernize the infrastructure." Calling it, quote, "an unprecedented investment in ensuring the nuclear security of our country and our allies," Thomas D'Agostino, the administrator of the National Nuclear Security Agency, on February 16, 2011 declared, quote, "Despite the economic challenges facing our nation and the budget pressures being felt throughout the federal government, the President demonstrated his commitment to our mission by proposing an unprecedented investment in ensuring the nuclear security of our country and our allies," end quote. This huge sum was the price exacted by the U.S. military-industrial complex and its representatives in the Senate for ratification of the New START Treaty on December 22, 2010. The political conditions attached to Senate ratification in the U.S., mirrored by Russia, effectively turned START into an anti-disarmament measure. This was stated in so many words by Senator Bob Corker, a Republican senator from Tennessee, whose state is home to the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, the site of a proposed multi-billion-dollar uranium processing facility for nuclear weapons. He said, quote, "I am proud that as a result of ratification, we have been successful in securing commitments from the administration on modernization of our nuclear arsenal and support of our missile defense programs, two things that would not have happened otherwise. In fact, thanks in part to the contributions my staff and I have been able to make, the New START Treaty could easily be called the Nuclear Modernization and Missile Defense Act of 2010. In Prague, President Obama declared, quote, "To put an end to Cold War thinking, we will reduce the role of nuclear weapons in our national security strategy and urge others to do the same." But this was immediately followed by, quote, "Make no mistake, as long as these weapons exist, the United States will maintain a safe, secure, and effective arsenal to deter any adversary and guarantee that defense to our allies." So what exactly is this deterrent? What does deterrence mean? It's really key to unraveling this whole problem. A typical understanding of Cold War deterrence meant maintaining the capacity to inflict a devastating retaliatory second strike or mutually assured destruction if either the United States or the Soviet Union attacked the other with nuclear weapons. But what did it really mean? What does it mean now? To jump directly to the punchline, deterrence encompasses the entire military-industrial complex and the national security state and elites that it serves, and not only in the United States. Deterrence is an ideology which has outlived its Cold War origins, and is used by the nuclear weapon states to justify the perpetual possession and threatened use, including first use, of nuclear weapons. Deterrence in post-Cold War U.S. national security doctrine goes well beyond the threat of retaliation. As stated in a September 2008 Department of Defense report on the Air Force's nuclear mission, quote, "Though our consistent goal has been to avoid actual weapons use, the nuclear deterrent is used every day by assuring friends and allies, dissuading opponents from seeking peer capabilities to the United States, deterring attacks on the United States and its allies from potential adversaries, and providing the potential to defeat adversaries if deterrence fails." End quote. In other words, the U.S. uses the threat of nuclear attack the same way a bank robber might use a gun held to the temple of a bank teller. In his 2007 book, Empire and the Bomb, How the U.S. Uses Nuclear Weapons to Dominate the World, Joseph Gerson wrote, "On at least 30 occasions since the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, every U.S. president has prepared and or threatened to initiate nuclear war during international crises, confrontations, and wars, primarily in the Third World." Just to give you some examples, in 1996, President Clinton made a covert nuclear threat against an alleged underground chemical weapons facility in Libya. And in 2002, President Bush had contingency plans drawn up for battlefield use of nuclear weapons in Iraq. Here's another description of nuclear deterrence from Strategic Command Vice Admiral Carl Monsey in January 2009. Quote, "Some argue that the only legitimate role for our nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear weapon use by others against us or our allies. And this is probably their most important role. But the deterrence role of U.S. nuclear forces goes well beyond deterrence of nuclear attack. They cast a long shadow over the decision-making of any adversary attempting attacks on U.S. vital interests or contemplating such attacks. They make it clear that the American president always has an option of last resort for which the adversary has no effective counter. They pose what's been called the threat that leaves something to chance, the possibility in the mind of the adversary that their actions could result in unintended or uncontrolled escalation. And these are the deterrence dynamics that only nuclear weapons can provide. Indeed, according to the Obama administration's April 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, quote, "The United States is not prepared at the present time to adopt a universal policy that the sole purpose of U.S. nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear attack on the United States and our allies and partners," end quote. Though it vaguely commits to, quote, work to establish the conditions under which such a policy could be safely adopted. And the Nuclear Posture Review does not rule out first use. The policy of nuclear deterrence is not passive and it's not benign. According to its proponents, maintaining a credible U.S. deterrent will require a massive new investment in the nuclear weapons infrastructure. In March 2008, General Kevin Chilton, the commander of Strategic Command, told Congress, quote, "If the nation is going to maintain a nuclear deterrent, the capabilities that support this deterrent should be second to none. We must care for the stockpile, whether we possess one weapon or thousands. A revitalized infrastructure will facilitate a reduction of the large inventory of weapons we maintain today as a hedge against strategic uncertainty and weapon reliability concerns, and will allow us to sustain our nuclear capability and expertise throughout the 21st century." And I just remind us that we're only in 2012. In November 2009, Chilton predicted the United States will need nuclear weapons 40 years into the future, stating, quote, "The president himself has said a world without nuclear weapons will not be reached quickly and perhaps not in his lifetime, and I agree with that. It's not because we couldn't physically cut up every weapon in the world in 40 years. We could. The question is, would it be a safer world if we did? Quoting from Obama's Prague speech, General Chilton said his command must focus on the president's confirmation that as long as nuclear weapons exist, the United States will maintain a safe, secure, and effective arsenal to deter any adversary and to guarantee that defense to our allies. In a profoundly disturbing speech to the U.S. Institute of Peace on October 21, 2009, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said, quote, "We are sincere in our pursuit of a secure, peaceful world without nuclear weapons. But until we reach the point of the horizon where the last nuclear weapon has been eliminated, we need to reinforce the domestic consensus that America will maintain the nuclear infrastructure needed to sustain a safe and effective deterrent without nuclear testing. So in addition to supporting a robust nuclear complex budget in 2011, we will also support a new stockpile management program that would focus on sustaining capabilities." Citing General Clinton, she added, "This is what the military leaders charged with responsibility for our strategic deterrent need in order to defend our country." And let me pause here and say that this is what Agneta was referring to when she talked about subcritical tests. This stockpile management program is a whole system of laboratory facilities and experimental facilities and supercomputers that functionally replace underground nuclear testing by providing the same data through other means. So although full-scale nuclear testing has stopped underground, it continues in the laboratory. Now there are several pages here which Agneta has not translated, and I just want to mention a couple of points here. In his February 2nd, 2011 message to the Senate on the New START Treaty, President Obama certified his intention to modernize or replace the triad of strategic nuclear weapon systems. That would be bomber airplanes, intercontinental ballistic submarines that are land-launched, and submarines carrying nuclear weapons. And also, he pledged to accelerate the design and engineering and construction of 3 new nuclear weapons production facilities.
Excuse me, Jackie. Yeah. I think you can take the whole, because this is recorded, isn't it, on the film? So we have it. You can take it.
Okay. Yeah. Fine. I don't want to put you guys to sleep. Okay. In his message to the Senate, the President also pledged to continue development and deployment of United States missile defense systems of all types, including the ground-based mid-course interceptors that are so provocative to Russia. And this deal for START ratification reprises and expands on the trade-off brokered by President Bill Clinton in the mid-1990s for Senate ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. In that case, although the Senate failed to ratify the treaty, the so-called Stockpile Stewardship Program was created and billions of dollars were poured into construction of massive new facilities for simulating nuclear test explosions and training new generations of nuclear weapons scientists. Research and development on new warheads and delivery systems continued, existing weapon types were modified, and the continued power and political influence of the nuclear weapons laboratories, which are, after all, the direct descendants of the Manhattan Project, and the vast array of government agencies, corporations, universities, and organizations within organizations that comprise the nuclear weapons establishment was projected into the future. As pointed out by United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in October 2008, quote, "Most states have chosen to forgo the nuclear option, yet some states view possession of such weapons as a status symbol. And some states view nuclear weapons as offering the ultimate deterrent of nuclear attack, which largely accounts for the estimated 26,000 that still exist. Unfortunately, the doctrine of nuclear deterrence has proven to be contagious. This has made nonproliferation more difficult which in turn raises new risks that nuclear weapons will be used. As Brazilian ambassador Luiz Felipe de Macedo Soares pointed out in his statement to the Conference on Disarmament, and this was in last year, 2011, the ideology of deterrence extends to other nuclear-possessing and nuclear-reliant states. Referring to the new strategic concept adopted by NATO in Lisbon on November 19, 2010, he declared, "A most powerful alliance proclaimed its renewed strategic doctrine expressly based on nuclear weapons. It is consequently difficult to grant credibility to any nuclear disarmament intention coming from any member of that alliance." Indeed, mirroring President Obama's Prague language, the strategic concept states, quote, "As long as nuclear weapons exist, NATO will remain a nuclear alliance." And I have to say, to step back from all this technical language, that the argument for nuclear weapons by those who insist they want to keep them and need them boils down to this. It's really unfortunate, but as long as nuclear weapons exist, nuclear weapons will exist. And that's just the logic of it. Mirroring President Obama's, let's see, where did I get this? Yes, I did said that already. So while the United States continues to maintain 150 to 200 tactical nuclear weapons at 6 bases in 5 NATO countries, according to NATO's strategic concept, the supreme guarantee of the security of the Allies is provided by the strategic nuclear forces of the alliance, particularly those of the United States, the independent strategic nuclear forces of the United Kingdom and France, which have a deterrent role of their own, contribute to the overall deterrence and security of the Allies. In a speech detailing the goals of the upcoming May 2012 NATO summit in President Obama's hometown of Chicago, NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen stated, quote, "To fulfill its essential purpose of safeguarding our security, the alliance needs the appropriate mix of capabilities, conventional, nuclear, and missile defense. We are currently reviewing that mix for approval in Chicago." And I would note that there was supposed to be a NATO-Russia side meeting in Chicago, which was canceled because the two sides were so far apart on the question of missile defenses. As calculated by Randy Rydell, the senior political affairs officer of the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, today over half the world's population lives in countries whose national security postures explicitly depend on nuclear weapons and the doctrine of nuclear deterrence. Final ratification of the New START Treaty by the Russian Parliament on January 26, 2011, was subject to its own reciprocal amendments, including grounds for Russia's withdrawal from the treaty and the Russian president's obligation to undertake a program to modernize Russia's strategic nuclear forces. Grounds for withdrawal include the unilateral deployment by the U.S. of missile defense systems and the adoption of strategic non-nuclear weapon systems, that is, conventional prompt global strike systems by the U.S. without Russia's approval. On February 5, 2010, Russia published its new military doctrine, which retains the nuclear first use option, reserving the right to use nuclear weapons not only in response to a nuclear attack or an attack with biological or chemical weapons, but also in response to a conventional attack. The new doctrine places the expansion of NATO's mission and the movement of the military infrastructure of NATO member countries closer to the borders of the Russian Federation at the top of its list of external military dangers to Russia. It also identifies the deployment of strategic missile defense systems, the militarization of outer space, which we're going to hear more about later, and the deployment of precision non-nuclear strategic weapon systems, all of these U.S. priorities associated with START ratification as threats that undermine global security. The main mission assigned to nuclear weapons by the new Russian doctrine is deterrence, defined as the, quote, prevention of nuclear military conflict or any other military conflict. This mission assumes, quote, the maintenance of strategic stability and the nuclear deterrence capability at the level of sufficiency. The notion of sufficiency is defined as ability to inflict predetermined or tailored damage to an aggressor. It is obvious to me that the ideology of nuclear deterrence must be directly challenged. Nuclear weapon-reliant states must no longer be allowed to justify the perpetual modernization and maintenance of terrifying nuclear arsenals and the massive investments in infrastructure to sustain them in terms of deterrence. Nuclear deterrence must be understood for what it is, the threatened use of nuclear weapons. In January 2010, the Four Horsemen, so-called, George Shultz, William Perry, Henry Kissinger, and Sam Nunn, peeled away some of the disarmament rhetoric from their now famous vision of a world free of nuclear weapons. You all know what I'm talking about? These are the four former Cold Warriors who got all kinds of attention for supposedly coming out for the abolition of nuclear weapons. In an op-ed entitled, quote, How to Protect Our Nuclear Deterrent, which appeared in the Wall Street Journal in January of 2010, they declared, quote, maintaining high confidence in our nuclear arsenal is critical as the numbers of these weapons go down. The United States must continue to attract, develop, and retain the outstanding scientists, engineers, designers, and technicians we will need to maintain our nuclear arsenal, whatever its size, for as long as the nation's security requires it. And they warned, quote, the deadliest weapons ever invented could fall into dangerous hands, calling for a substantial increase in funding for the U.S. nuclear weapons laboratories and a modernized nuclear weapons infrastructure to prevent this from happening. The Four Horsemen's analysis and recommendations were endorsed by Vice President Joseph Biden 10 days later in another Wall Street Journal op-ed announcing the administration's inflated fiscal year 2011 budget request. Unfortunately, this circular reasoning is very short-sighted. Investing in a modernized nuclear weapons infrastructure will be viewed as hypocritical by other nations, and it will provide the next president and future presidents the means to design and build new nuclear weapons if they so choose, and thus to spark new arms races. In their op-ed, the Four Horsemen invoked the specter of nuclear weapons falling into quote-unquote dangerous hands 3 times. Yet in whose hands are nuclear weapons safe? The only hands that have used them so far? As the Hans Blix-led Weapons of Mass Destruction Commission stated in its 2006 report, the Commission rejects the suggestion that nuclear weapons in the hands of some pose no threat, while in the hands of others they place the world in mortal jeopardy. As they wisely observed, quote, governments possessing nuclear weapons can act responsibly or recklessly. Governments may also change over time. In short, nuclear weapons are dangerous in anyone's hands. In a time of twin global economic and environmental crises and growing competition over natural resources, the dangers of conflicts among nuclear armed states are increasing. Frankly, I'm much more concerned about the potential for escalation of conflict among nuclear armed states leading to nuclear war than I am about the potential use by a state of nuclear weapons which do not yet exist, or by subnational groups that do not yet have them. We can't afford to wait decades more for the elimination of nuclear weapons. Seriously moving toward abolition of nuclear weapons will require taking on other challenges as well, but this is not a reason to delay any longer delegitimizing deterrence and eliminating the role of nuclear weapons in national security policies. I've identified some of the, and this is where we pick up again in Swedish for those of you who are following the text. I've identified some of the inconvenient truths that lie between the recent wave of promising rhetoric and the realities that will have to be addressed to bring its promise to fruition. Another inconvenient truth is the NPT Article 4 promise of peaceful nuclear technology to states that agree to forego nuclear weapons. Article 4 of the NPT refers to an inalienable right of non-nuclear weapon states to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. But by allowing for states to build up the capacity and infrastructure, though ostensibly civilian energy and research programs, through ostensibly civilian energy and research programs, to produce nuclear weapons within a brief time period, this presents a major problem for the confident achievement and sustainability of a world free of nuclear weapons. The pursuit of nuclear technology, as we're seeing with Iran, has become a leading cause of controversy and conflict around the world due to the inherently dual-use nature of the nuclear fuel cycle. The U.S.-India nuclear deal, approved by the Nuclear Suppliers Group and the U.S. Congress in late 2008, will provide India, a non-NPT party, with nuclear technology and materials that might enable it to further develop its weapons program. It was reported at the time that Pakistan and Israel, both non-NPT nuclear-armed states, were pursuing similar deals. Another U.S. nuclear trade agreement was made with the United Arab Emirates in 2009. Now there is growing controversy in the U.S. Senate over a new Obama administration policy unveiled in January that would relax existing standards by taking a case-by-case approach in deciding whether to demand the strictest non-proliferation measures in trade deals that give non-nuclear weapon states access to U.S. atomic technology and materials. Commitments by nuclear cooperation partners not to enrich uranium or reprocess plutonium on their soil would not necessarily be sought in every negotiation. Prospective new U.S. nuclear sharing deals with Vietnam and Jordan, as well as Saudi Arabia, are currently on the table. Members of the Saudi royal family have reportedly suggested that Saudi Arabia might seek to build or acquire nuclear weapons to counter Israel and Iran. The potential for further inflaming already volatile regions of the world by adding nuclear capacity is obvious. Additional negatives, such as the extreme public health and environmental risks of nuclear energy, as exemplified by the Chernobyl and Fukushima disasters, the intractable problem of disposition of long-lived, high-level radioactive waste, and the huge capital costs of nuclear energy are well known. However, there is another less frequently examined negative dimension. Nuclear power, the most expensive form of centralized energy generation, is an inefficient way to deliver energy to the world's vast underserved populations, particularly those in rural areas. Investing the immense capital needed to construct nuclear plants in decentralized, renewable energy technologies worldwide also would promote further innovation and bring down prices, encouraging their spread. This approach would improve energy access, provide employment, and broaden the economic potential of areas left out of the current system of corporate globalization, reducing both greenhouse gas emissions and oil consumption, and reducing as a consequence competition for shrinking oil and gas supplies that is, among other things, a significant factor driving global conflict. So I want to talk about atoms for peace, then and now. In connection with the Nuclear Security Summit in Seoul, Korea last week, President Obama addressed an audience at Hancock University, reprising his inspiring rhetoric of the 2009 Prague speech, and with an eye towards the upcoming NPT PrepCom meeting, he stated, quote, "America's leadership has been essential to progress in taking concrete steps towards a world without nuclear weapons. As party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, this is our obligation, and it's one that I take very seriously. But I believe the United States has a unique responsibility to act. Indeed, we have a moral obligation. I say this as president of the only nation ever to use nuclear weapons." However, just as in the Prague speech, Obama went on to reinforce the U.S. commitment to the doctrine of deterrence and all that it implies. He said, quote, "Even after New START, the United States will have more than 1,500 deployed nuclear weapons and some 5,000 warheads. I firmly believe that we can ensure the security of the United States and our allies, maintain a strong deterrent against any threat, and still pursue further reductions in our nuclear arsenal. After sternly warning Iran and North Korea that nuclear weapons aspirations on their parts would not be tolerated, without a trace of irony, Obama declared, quote, "For the global response to Iran and North Korea's intransigence, a new international norm is emerging. Treaties are binding, rules will be enforced, and violations will have consequences. We refuse to consign ourselves to a future where more and more regimes possess the world's most deadly weapons." I was amazed to read what came next. Quote, "A renewed commitment to harnessing the power of the atom, not for war, but for peaceful purposes," end quote. He goes on, quote, "After the tragedy at Fukushima, it was right and appropriate that nations moved to improve the safety and security of nuclear facilities. As we do, let's never forget the astonishing benefits that nuclear technology has brought to our lives. Nuclear technology helps make our food safe. It prevents disease in the developing world. It's the high-tech medicine that treats cancer and finds new cures. And of course, it's the energy, the clean energy, that helps cut the carbon pollution that contributes to climate change. That's why in the United States, we've restarted our nuclear industry. We've supported the first new nuclear power plant in 3 decades. In a stunning expression of what I can best describe as magical thinking, President Obama concluded by describing perfectly the inextricable link between nuclear powers and nuclear weapons, and then wishing it away. He said, quote, "We all know the problem. The very process that gives us nuclear energy can also put nations and terrorists within the reach of nuclear weapons. We simply can't go on accumulating huge amounts of the very material, like separated plutonium, that we're trying to keep away from terrorists. And that's why we're creating new fuel banks to help countries realize the energy they seek without increasing the nuclear dangers that we fear. And today, I urge nations to join us in seeking a future where we harness the awesome power of the atom to build and not to destroy." Now, some of you are old enough to probably remember hearing similar kind of rhetoric in the early 1950s. I was struck by the eerie similarities to President Eisenhower's famous Atoms for Peace speech to the United Nations General Assembly in December 1953, nearly 60 years ago. In that speech, Eisenhower acknowledged the terrible destructive power represented by the then growing U.S. nuclear arsenal. Quote, "Today, the United States stockpile of atomic weapons, which of course increases daily, exceeds by many times the total explosive equivalent of the total of all bombs and all shells that came from every plane and every gun in every theater of war in all the years of World War II." And I note that when he said that, the U.S. had 1,161 nuclear weapons. Today, there are about 8,500. Eisenhower warned of the dangers of a looming nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union, and that, quote, "the knowledge now possessed by several nations will eventually be shared by others, possibly all others." Seeking a way out of this conundrum, he declared, quote, "My country's purpose is to help us move out of the dark chamber of horrors into the light, to find a way by which the minds of men, the hopes of men, the souls of men everywhere can move forward towards peace and happiness and well-being." Calling for the elimination of nuclear weapons, he made a bold proposal. Quote, "The United States would seek more than the mere reduction or elimination of atomic materials for military purposes. It is not enough to take this weapon out of the hands of the soldiers. It must be put into the hands of those who will know how to strip its military casing and adapt it to the arts of peace. The United States knows that if the fearful trend of atomic military buildup can be reversed, this greatest of destructive forces can be developed into a great boon for the benefit of all mankind. The United States knows that peaceful power from atomic energy is no dream of the future. That capability, already proved, is here now, today. Who can doubt if the entire body of the world's scientists and engineers had adequate amounts of fissionable material with which to test and develop their ideas, that this capability would rapidly be transformed into universal, efficient, and economic usage? End quote. Nuclear weapons and nuclear power are preeminent examples of the irrationality of the whole. Nuclear energy risks destroying society in order to power it. Nuclear weapons risk destroying the people to save the state. As global tensions rise over speculation about Iran's and North Korea's nuclear intentions, apparently we haven't learned anything. If we are to achieve a world of human and ecological security, I believe we must phase out and move beyond nuclear power as well as fossil fuels. Now, the next section of the paper is specifics about nuclear weapons budgets and modernization programs in all the nuclear weapon states. And I'm not going to take the time to read through that. You have it, but I'll just make a couple of key points.
But I think this is important to understand the difference between the United States of America and, for instance, Russia and China. The budget is striking to read, so I urge you to
Okay, I will happily do so.
Please do.
Are you doing okay out there? All right.
Oh no, you don't. You can stand up if you want.
Okay.
She's almost finished.
Let me have a sip of water. Okay. So the big picture is that due largely to government secrecy, it is nearly impossible to calculate total annual spending on nuclear weapons. But according to a June 2011 nuclear weapons cost study by Global Zero, as a conservative estimate, world spending on nuclear weapons and related programs will surpass $1 trillion in total over the next decade. The U.S. nuclear weapons design and production complex consists of 8 major facilities. The Obama administration's fiscal year 2013 request for nuclear weapons activities, that is, programs directly related to maintenance and modernization of warheads, which is funded by the Department of Energy National Nuclear Security Administration, is approximately $7.6 billion, an increase of about 5% above the 2012 enacted level. The new plutonium pit facility, which is being designed to manufacture up to 125 plutonium pits a year, pits are the cores of nuclear weapons, has been deferred for 5 years, but proposed funding for the uranium processing facility at Oak Ridge, which I mentioned earlier, to make the uranium secondary components of nuclear weapons, has been increased to $340 million, which is up 112% from last year. The total project cost for that facility is estimated between $4 and $7.5 billion. A third new facility to manufacture non-nuclear components for nuclear weapons, which is under construction in Kansas City, Missouri, is being funded through a controversial private contracting arrangement. This is the first privatized nuclear weapons component facility in the United States. The 2013 budget request also includes funding for so-called life extension programs. Don't you like their language? Wouldn't you like to have some life extension programs? These are rebuilds for 3 warhead types, including the B-61 bomb, which is still deployed at NATO bases in Europe.
Yeah, that's why I wanted you to read that.
I will. Now, the Department of Energy budget covers only the nuclear warheads. And in addition, in response to the President's commitment to modernize all 3 legs of the strategic triad of nuclear weapons delivery systems, the Department of Defense, which is also called the Pentagon, fiscal year 2013 budget request includes $565 million in funding for a new replacement Trident submarine, though that's been delayed by 2 years, but that's projected to be in operation through 2080. Also, as much as $11.6 million in funding and research for the development of a new intercontinental ballistic missile, approximately $2 million in funding for a new air-launched cruise missile, approximately $292 million, or a total of $6.3 billion from fiscal year 13 to 17 for a new long-range bomber, which they're planning to build 80 to 100 of. And of note, on January 6th of 2011, Defense Secretary Robert Gates announced that the Air Force would begin development of this new nuclear-capable strategic bomber, which can be remotely piloted. So at present, in other words, a nuclear-capable drone. At present, there are no nuclear-capable drones in the U.S. arsenal. Despite President Obama's recent statement in Seoul that in his nuclear posture review, I made it clear that the United States will not develop new nuclear warheads, and we will continue not to pursue new military missions for nuclear weapons, the projected development of the B-61-12 bomb with enhanced targeting capabilities to be carried by a new aircraft, the F-35 with stealth capabilities, illustrates qualitative modernization arising from replacement of existing systems and warheads. And that's the one that will be deployed at the NATO bases in Europe. Similarly, life extension of the W-76 submarine-based warhead added to its capability to hit hard targets. Now, this is the, let's see, what's the total number? Over $200 billion projected for U.S. nuclear weapons programs through 2020. But that was just for this year. Yeah. Russia will spend an estimated $70 billion during that same period in core costs on new strategic arms. This includes new strategic submarines, silo and mobile land-based rockets, warhead production and maintenance, and supporting command control systems, not including maintaining Russia's thousands of tactical nuclear weapons and delivery vehicles. China's nuclear weapons budget is very difficult to discern, but as part of an ambitious military modernization program in the next decade, China is planning to produce 5 new strategic submarines and a fleet of long-range land-based rockets, while increasing its arsenal from 190 weapons today to upwards of 250 to 300. In France, in 2010, France deployed its 4th and final Triomphant-class ballistic missile submarine. These are being equipped with an M51 ballistic missile, nuclear missile, which have significantly greater range and yield capability than the existing M45 missiles. So in other words, another qualitative upgrade. France is also modernizing its air-based nuclear component. France's nuclear budget is not public. But France is working closely with the United Kingdom's nuclear stockpile maintenance using laboratory-based experiments and computer simulations similar to the program in the United States. And the UK will decide by 2016 whether to replace its 4 Trident nuclear submarines at a cost of up to $40 billion by the time the first submarines enter service in 2028. That doesn't include missiles or operating costs. So in other words, again, very long-range planning horizons for these big industrial operations that have a momentum of their own. India and Pakistan do not officially release their weapons budgets, but those 2 countries are engaged in a frightening new arms race to increase the size of their nuclear arsenals and to develop new types of delivery systems. North Korea has conducted 2 nuclear tests, produced enough plutonium for up to 12 atom bombs, and is developing infrastructure to enrich uranium for nuclear bombs. This secretive nuclear weapon state does not yet have long-range missile delivery systems, but has undertaken a program to develop this capability. Finally, Israel. We must always mention Israel when we're talking about nuclear weapon states. Their nuclear weapons program is completely secret, but reportedly has focused on acquiring a fleet of 5 to 6 submarines capable of firing nuclear-armed cruise missiles at an estimated cost of $1 billion each. And Regina just told me that Germany is preparing to sell Israel a new submarine for this purpose. Israel also possesses aircraft and land-based ballistic missiles capable of delivering its nuclear arsenal, whose size was estimated by the U.S. Pentagon to be about 80 weapons, modest projected increases through 2020. So, let me give you a couple of stories about blatant nuclear hypocrisy, double standards, and dual use. While the U.S. government very publicly lectures and threatens Iran and North Korea about the evils of nuclear weapons and missiles, little known to most people, it routinely test fires its own long-range nuclear missiles and warheads from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. Each test launch sends a clearly implied nuclear threat to the world. On June 22, 2011, the U.S. Air Force Global Strike Command launched that's their name. The U.S. Air Force Global Strike Command launched a Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile from Vandenberg. The missile, carrying a simulated nuclear warhead, traveled 4,200 miles before hitting its predetermined target in the Marshall Islands. According to the missile director, quoted in an Air Force press release, quote, Minuteman III test launches demonstrate our nation's ICBM capability in a very visible way, deterring potential adversaries while reassuring allies. These launches provide valuable information on the missile's effectiveness in its intended operational environment. You understand? They simulate an actual use. The U.S. maintains 488 Minuteman III missiles on high alert in silos in Wyoming, Nebraska, and North Dakota. The most recent Minuteman III test launch was conducted on February 25, 2012. According to the Air Force, each missile test costs more than $20 million. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, in 2010, nearly 1 in 6 Americans was living in poverty, the highest level since 1993. On February 9th of this year, in a State Department press release, spokesperson Victoria Nuland declared that, quote, with regard to U.S. sanctions against Iran, we don't want to hurt the Iranian people any more than we need to. But they are living in a state with a government that would rather spend money on a nuclear weapons program than on the welfare of its people. And that's why we are compelled to increase the pressure and increase the isolation until they see the light. That one is the most amazing quote of its type I have ever found. Here's the second story. On March 16, 2012, North Korea declared its intention to place an orbiting system into space via a long-range rocket launch, setting off an international media uproar. The rocket launch in April will commemorate the 100th anniversary of the birth of North Korea's founder, Kim Il-sung. The U.S. State Department claims that a long-range rocket launch would violate UN Security Council resolutions which prohibit North Korean ballistic missile firings. North Korea's official news agency claims that the rocket will carry an Earth observation satellite into space. According to that same U.S. State Department spokesperson Victoria Nuland, quote, North Korea's announcement that it plans to conduct a missile launch in direct violation of its international obligations is highly provocative, end quote. The U.S. sentiments were echoed by Russia and Japan, who also believe that the rocket launch is part of an effort to develop a long-range ballistic missile. The U.S. strongly signaled that it would call off a bilateral nuclear shutdown for food deal with North Korea if it goes through with the long-range rocket test, and has subsequently put that deal on hold. Meanwhile, with little fanfare on March 23rd, just last week, Vandenberg Air Force Base issued a press release announcing that it is scheduled to launch a Delta IV medium rocket carrying a, quote, national security payload on March 29th. The classified national security payload is probably a spy satellite. North Korea has accused the U.S. of being confrontational and applying double standards on satellite capabilities. According to a spokesman for the North Korean Foreign Ministry, quote, we will never give up the launch of a satellite for peaceful purposes. He suggested that the Obama administration drop the confrontation conception and make a bold decision to acknowledge that we also have a right to launch satellites. According to International Crisis Group expert Daniel Pinkerton, rockets for lifting satellites into space are, quote, inherently dual-use technology. If you can launch a satellite, you can deliver a warhead at long range. These examples illustrate what Alva Myrdal, Swedish Minister of Disarmament and winner of the 1982 Nobel Peace Prize, called the game of disarmament in her book of the same name. In the game of disarmament, Alva Myrdal asks, quote, how can we let the nationalistic security needs as defined and exaggerated by military and other vested interests misguide our societies? How can we allow secretiveness and falsifications of reality to motivate the continued arms race with all the dangers and burdens thereof? The common man should demand honest accountability of the policymakers. He has the right to question their ethics. To delegitimize nuclear deterrence as a step towards abolishing nuclear weapons, our task is to change the discourse from the bottom up. And when it comes right down to it, I believe this is the only thing we can do, but it could not be more important. Changing the discourse will require the courage not only to speak truth to power, as Alva Myrdal suggests, but also to speak truth to each other, which is what Agneta was modeling at the beginning of this meeting. And let me close with an example in my experience. Last year, I was asked to sign onto a letter initiated by nuclear weapons abolitionists calling on members of the Russian State Duma and the U.S. Congress to increase decision-making time for strategic nuclear weapons. This is popularly called de-alerting. I read the letter carefully, and I was horrified when I encountered the following argument, quote, a recent article in the prestigious journal Foreign Affairs shows convincingly that de-alerted nuclear forces would still be able to inflict crippling and unacceptable retaliatory strikes against an opponent that struck first. So-called deterrence would therefore not be compromised by increasing decision-making time and strategic stability by de-alerting, end quote. This was the letter advocating de-alerting. I was compelled to write to the authors and initial signers of the letter, including some good friends and colleagues. This is what I wrote. Dear friends, I'm sorry, but I cannot sign on to any letter supporting de-alerting which relies on the argument above. While seemingly practical on the surface, this is the argument of militaristic national security states and their elites. It should not be our argument. Deterrence is an ideology which has been used to justify perpetual possession and threatened use of nuclear weapons. I believe that deterrence must be thoroughly discredited and denied any form of legitimacy if we are to make any real progress toward the eventual elimination of nuclear weapons. If you believe the facts stated in the previous paragraph of your letter, quote, the use by miscalculation or malfunction of even a small fraction of the U.S. or Russian strategic arsenals would terminate not just civilization, but would threaten the elimination of most humans and many other complex forms of life, end quote, why would any humanitarian, environmentalist, or nuclear abolitionist support the idea of nuclear retaliation? I believe that our job is to debunk this bizarre and abhorrent concept and develop and promote an alternative view of universal and sustainable security based on meeting human needs and protecting the environment. This is a view that has the potential to attract the broad international public support needed to create the political will to counter the reliance by states on overwhelming military, including nuclear weapons threats. Several signers wrote back expressing their appreciation to me for pointing out the contradictions in the letter and asking for it to be changed. A few others argued that these are the kinds of arguments we need to make to convince the generals. In the end, the offensive paragraph was removed and replaced with the language of abolition, which could not be interpreted as condoning deterrence in any way. I believe that we will never convince the generals by trying to make arguments on their terms. We need to change the paradigm. We need to change the discourse by creating and sticking to our own narrative, no matter who we're talking to. In order to mobilize public opinion, I believe that we need to move from the irrational fear-based ideology of deterrence to the rational fear of an eventual nuclear weapon use, whether by accident or design, by a nuclear weapon state that places the threatened use of nuclear weapons at the core of its national security policy. We also need to stimulate a rational hope that security can be redefined in humanitarian and ecologically sustainable terms that will lead to the elimination of nuclear weapons and dramatic demilitarization, freeing up tremendous resources desperately needed to address universal human needs. And I end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie Cabasso. I think we have a short break now for just to think over what, and then come back. And at 1 o'clock we have lunch, formal lunch. So I think we move a little, and then we think over what kind of questions we want to pose to Jackie Cabasso. Thank you very, very much.
Welcome.
Eloquent and knowledgeable as always. So we can move a little and have a break. And that question and